Hey, welcome! Today, we're going to break down a source that uncovers a really challenging history. One, it argues, has been almost totally silenced.
So the source material opens with this really powerful question. It kind of makes you stop and think. It contrasts the transatlantic slave trade, which is, common knowledge, with what it calls this deep, profound silence around the Arab-Muslim slave trade. And here's the kicker. The source claims this other trade was far older and much, much bigger.
Okay, let's just dive right into the numbers, because the source puts them on the table immediately. Look at this. The Arab-Muslim trade, it says, lasted for 1,400 years. Think about that, from the 7th to the 20th century, and it victimized an estimated 17 million people. Compare that to the transatlantic trade, 400 years, 12 million victims. This huge difference in both time and scale is really the core of the whole analysis we're about to break down.
So let's dig into the core arguments the source is making. It starts by taking on a very common perception, one it really wants to tear down.
Yeah, this is the perception the source highlights. This quote apparently came from a colloquium in Morocco, and it really sums up the idea that slavery in Islam was different, more like being a member of the family. So the source basically asks, okay, does that claim actually hold up to scrutiny?
And to test that whole well-treated slave claim, the research presented goes right to the source, the foundational texts of Islam itself.
Okay, first up, it points to a hadith. That's a reported saying of the Prophet Muhammad. The source is very specific about choosing this one, because in Islamic tradition, it's considered to have the highest level of authenticity. And the topic is what to do with an escaped slave.
So the source presents this text as a direct contradiction to that whole member of the family narrative. I mean, it's a shocking act, right? A master catches his runaway slave and slits his throat. And the source uses this to really question the whole idea of a more benevolent form of slavery.
The analysis then moves on, pointing to another hadith. This one is used to argue that the Prophet Muhammad himself was an active participant in the slave trade.
The source interprets this passage as a pretty clear commercial transaction. It describes the prophet exchanging one slave for two other slaves. This is used to frame the practice not as something familial, but as a business, plain and simple.
But the analysis doesn't stop with the hadith. From there, the source turns to the Quran itself to look at the specific rights granted to slave owners.
So the crucial part here, according to the source, is that phrase, what your right hands possess. The research we're looking at argues that this is widely understood as a permission in the Quran for masters to have sexual relations with their female slaves without needing to marry them. This effectively places them in a completely different category than wives.
So, moving beyond the religious texts, the source tries to illustrate the massive scale of this trade with some pretty shocking numbers and brutal practices.
The source puts forward this staggering number again, an estimated 17 million Africans deported into the Arab-Muslim world. To really let that sink in, that's 5 million more people than the estimated number of victims in the transatlantic trade.
And the duration, according to this research, the trade operated for a mind-boggling 1,400 years, from the 7th all the way up to the 20th century, a timeline that just absolutely dwarfs the 400 years of the transatlantic trade. The source also highlights some incredibly brutal practices to really drive its point home. It claims that raids would specifically target children, who are considered easier to control. The journey across the desert was often a death sentence. But the source places a special emphasis on the systematic castration of male slaves. It claims this operation had a mortality rate of 70 to 80%, just staggering, and that of course made the survivors, the eunuchs, incredibly valuable commodities.
Which of course brings us back to that central question. If this history is so stark, why isn't it more widely discussed? The source proposes a reason, and it's a fascinating one, rooted in identity and psychology.
To explain this, the source cites the Senegalese scholar Tidiane Niaye, who uses the term Stockholm Syndrome. Now, Niaye argues that there's a kind of religious solidarity at play, because the descendants of the victims and the descendants of the perpetrators are now often co-religionists. He argues it prevents a direct and honest confrontation with this dark history.
And this illustrates another major point the source makes, that early racial theories were actually developed in the Arab world to justify the whole practice. It points to really respected scholars, like the 14th century thinker Ibn Khaldun, who, the source alleges, wrote texts framing black people as being on a lower degree of humanity, closer to animals, and therefore naturally suited for slavery.
So, The source starts to wrap up its argument by drawing a really sharp contrast. It compares the historical reckonings of the West with what it calls a profound silence and a complete lack of accountability from the Arab Muslim world.
This timeline is presented as key evidence. You've got the British Empire, France, the US, all abolishing slavery in the 19th century, but then the source points to Saudi Arabia, 1962, and it claims this only happened because of sustained international pressure.
And this brings us right to the source's final core argument. It says that while the West has gone through a kind of mea culpa, an admission of guilt, through laws, education, public memory, it argues that a similar process of historical reckoning just hasn't happened in the Arab Muslim world.
So, ultimately, the source material leaves us with a really provocative thought. It challenges us to think critically about how historical stories are built. Who gets to decide which histories are remembered and which are forgotten? It forces us to ask why some tragedies become central to our past, while others, as this source argues, remain almost entirely in the shadows. And what's our responsibility once we know?